And I think we'll try to expedite this since we've been here almost 3 hours. Mr. Virginis, this year's floods have devastated communities across the nation. How do we help ensure that the Corps helps to rebuild? How we build it better? Do you think the funding is sufficient to do so?
I do not think the funding is sufficient. And again, as outlined in our testimony, and it was very interesting to hear the comments about how we can bring this to bear on all communities, right? Not just in communities with authorized projects. And the Corps has so much expertise, but it is unable physically to go out into communities to help with planning and doing projects, even projects where a community might want to do it themselves. So that's one aspect of it. The other is, you know, I was reading about a report that came out, I think in the last week or so, that used the example of if we use the option of seawalls, that across the nation we're looking at about a $400 billion price tag when it comes to dealing with sea level rise. And the intent of that study was not to say we need seawalls everywhere, but the intent of that study was to start getting our arms around the magnitude of the flooding problem that we face with the future conditions that we're going to be dealing with. And so the $100 billion backlog that we talk about is really small compared to just what we're going to be facing on our coasts.
Mr. Brockbank and Ms. Hill Gabriel, we hear more of the reports of coastal beach closure because of the algae bloom. What is the ecological and economic consequences of algae blooms? What are your recommendations for long-term solutions? How does it affect communities and tourism and fishing and the lost revenue?
Certainly the economics of algae bloom are devastating to local communities who rely on beach tourism as a primary source of their economic well-being. ASBPA doesn't work on water quality issues, but we are very actively trying to support these communities that have economic base, beach tourism economic base. And so I think whatever the Corps is able to do to ensure that the water quality is of a sufficient standard to maintain that base, is absolutely critical.
And thank you for that question. I think another important factor to think about is the need to coordinate between local government, state government, and the federal government. There are many things that are outside of the Army Corps' mission that they do not have control over that often contribute to the algae blooms. So looking at where, for example, there are state water quality issues that need to be addressed that end up having a confluence with the water management issues that the Army Corps is responsible for, we have to look at these things comprehensively. Almost in every case where we see a massive algal bloom problem, there's not one silver bullet solution. So ensuring that we bring the right people together to talk about each different decision maker or entity's responsibility in trying to address the problem is critically important. And I just have to share that, you know, I saw Congressman Mast put up the pictures of the algal bloom in the St. Lucie estuary in Florida. And I remember that about 3 years ago, I went when it was particularly bad and went out there for the first time. I lived in Florida at the time, but not right there. And I parked my car and I opened the door and I was across the street from the water. And I thought, oh, I must have parked next to a dumpster. I was not parked next to a dumpster. This is something that, you know, so far away, the smell was just really overcomes you, and it truly is something that you physically feel in your eyes, and it immediately makes it challenging. So of course people are not going to want to come to these destinations that are, you know, world-renowned tourist destinations when that's the impacts that they're feeling. And so the economic damages that occur as a result of that are clear.
Well, do you find that the agencies don't always talk to each other? Because when I was in state government, I had to bring them together to talk to each other and cooperate with each other, but doesn't that sound like it would be the norm? I
think we wish it would, but that's certainly always a challenge, is a need for someone to take a leadership helm and make sure that those people are brought together to the table at the right time to have the right discussion, and that everyone is willing and ready to address their contribution to the problem.
Dr. Martin, one of the sites being considered by the organization is Prado Dam, which is in my region. I know all sites are different, as you explained. What are the lessons learned from Lake Mendocino, and how can you apply those to other reservoirs like Prado?
One of the calculations that needs to be made is it involves how the reservoir is operated. If it's operated such that it may need 2 or 3 days lead time, we can do better at forecasting 2 or 3 days out. If it requires 7 or 10 days, that's going to be a different story. It's very tough to get these storms right 7 or 10 days out. So a lot of it depends on the character of the watershed and the dam itself.
Would that require cooperation of the agencies to be aware of it?
Oh, absolutely, and we've been very well received by agencies wanting to discuss this.
Thank you. Mr. Westerman, you're recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair.